Welcome. If you crave chilling true crime stories, real mysteries, and twists you'll never see coming, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and join a community that never looks away from the truth. Because every week, we shine a light where others won't. Are you ready? Let's begin. People think a city shows its soul in grand things, skyline, parades, monuments. They're wrong. A city shows its soul in the small, intimate places, laundromats with broken dryers, secondhand dress shops at dawn, the faded sewing rooms tucked behind neon signs. You can feel it in the smell of hot fabric, the hiss of steam presses, the stubborn thread clinging to every corner. That's where the story began, not in headlines or sirens. In a spool of thread, caught where it didn't belong. It started with a missing woman named June Alvarez, 32. A part-time seamstress, a mother, a woman most people in her neighborhood knew, if only by the way she could fix a zipper while making small talk about the weather. June had this reputation, not glamorous, not dramatic, just steady. She altered wedding dresses for brides who couldn't afford boutiques, hemmed trousers for old men who wore their best pants to church. The kind of quiet presence a city forgets until it's gone. Her van was found on a side street, parked in the shadow of the old textile mill. The building itself had been dead for decades, its windows shattered, walls tattooed with graffiti, the air around it stale with mildew. But the van was too clean in its wrongness. The engine cold, the driver's side door unlocked. No purse, no phone, and on the windshield wiper, snagged like it had tried to hold on, was a single spool of white thread, just sitting there, too delicate to be accidental, too precise not to mean something. A ribbon marking a crime no one had yet named. The responding officers bagged it, puzzled, but otherwise shrugged. People vanish in cities all the time, they told themselves. But Detective Casey Hart was assigned because of that thread. Not because she knew textiles, but because she knew patterns. Casey was 35, sharp-eyed, and sharper-tongued when she needed to be. Before homicide, she'd spent 3 years as a behavioral analyst trainee with the State Bureau. Not the kind of trainee who gets to kick down doors, but the one who sits in the aftermath, sifting through the wreckage of people's worst decisions. She learned to notice the small things criminals leave behind. A lighter dropped in a hallway, a magazine folded to the same page every time, a favorite song played obsessively before a crime. Patterns were patient, Casey knew. They waited for the right eyes. Her colleagues joked she was cursed. Every time she worked a case, she wound up knee-deep in the strangest details. But it was exactly that knack that put her in front of June Alvarez's van. The coroner's team combed through it. No body, no clear struggle, just fragments. A bloody smear in the back seat. Bits of sloughed skin tangled in the seatbelt, as though someone had fought against being strapped in. And in the sewing kit June always carried with her, tucked among needles and thimbles, was a piece of fabric that didn't belong. A small hexagon of quilted cloth. The stitching was immaculate, almost reverent. Too precise, too intentional. It wasn't from any of June's clients. 3 weeks later, another disappearance. This time, a man, Arthur Klein, 47, a city bus driver. Arthur wasn't flashy either. His neighbors described him as polite, punctual, the kind of man who waved to kids as they crossed the street. He wasn't married, but he kept a tidy apartment, and every Christmas he volunteered to drive senior citizens to the city's tree lighting. His last shift was caught on the depot's CCTV. He pulled the bus into its final stop, engine rumbling as rain streaked down the windshield. He stepped outside, stretching his back like drivers always do, rain soaking into his uniform. Nothing unusual, until a figure approached. The footage was grainy, but you could make out the essentials. A person in gloves, posture calm, movements deliberate. They handed Arthur something small. Folded. He glanced down at it, nodded, and tucked it into his pocket. Then the two walked out of frame. 2 hours later, Arthur's bus was found parked neatly along a parkway. No Arthur. Driver's seat wiped clean, steering wheel polished bare. The only thing left was a handkerchief, starched stiff as glass, wrapped carefully around a matchbook. The matchbook bore the name of a tailor shop. A shop that had closed 15 years earlier. By now, the detectives started to talk, quietly at first, then with the kind of hushed urgency you only hear when cops know they're chasing something different. Each missing person had some link to fabric. A seamstress, A driver with a handkerchief. A bus, as ordinary as cloth, but left folded in on itself. Casey noticed it before anyone else. The signatures weren't random. They were sewn into the crime scenes like hidden seams. The squad started calling the suspect the Weaver. Casey didn't laugh at the nickname. To her, it wasn't clever. It was accurate. Someone was threading these vanishings together, stitch by stitch. When the second disappearance hit the news, Casey went digging. She spent long hours in the basement of headquarters, surrounded by files that smelled of dust and mildew. Paper edges curled from decades of handling. And she found them, scattered over 5 years, quietly closed when leads ran out. Not many, but enough. 6 files. Each one a disappearance. Each one containing some small textile anomaly. A button with a hole arrangement that didn't match any known garment. A swatch of fabric embroidered with knots in a sequence like code. A scarf tied in a style no one could identify. The pattern was there, patient and waiting. And now, Casey realized it was waking up again. Then came the letter. It arrived at headquarters in a plain envelope, the kind that looked like junk mail. But the address line was too exact, the block handwriting too deliberate. Inside, folded crisply, was a letter from the state penitentiary, from a man no one wanted to hear from, but everyone remembered. Elias Crow, a former professor of forensic linguistics, convicted arsonist, a man whose intelligence was once legendary before it turned inward and burned everything around him. Elias was known for letters, precise, clinical, dissecting human behavior the way a surgeon dissects tissue. He had a reputation for pulling truths out of language the way others pulled threads from cloth. The letter read, "Patterns tell stories when people do not. You seek a weaver. Look for where threads cross. Not in the mills, but in the small rooms behind them." That was all. No signature. No demand. Just a breadcrumb from a man locked in a cell. Casey wanted to throw it out. She hated giving men like Elias oxygen. But she didn't. Because buried in those sentences was a truth she couldn't ignore. She carried the letter to her captain's office. The moment it hit the desk, the investigation map on the wall, red pins, threads crisscrossing neighborhoods, seemed to shift. For the first time in weeks, it looked alive. Casey arranged a visit. That was when the dynamic shifted from puzzles on paper to a psychological chessboard. She'd read Elias Crow's case file 3 times before walking into the penitentiary, convicted of setting 3 separate fires, all in buildings tied to academic disputes. He'd once been a professor of forensic linguistics at the university, teaching classes on coded language and the art of concealment. His students remembered him as brilliant but exhausting. His colleagues remembered him as brilliant but dangerous. And now, here he sat, in a cell no bigger than a laundry room. White walls, metal bed bolted down, the smell of bleach heavy in the air. Elias wore an old wool sweater, one that had been stitched and restitched, tiny careful repairs marking every seam. It was the kind of sweater you kept not for warmth, but for ritual. He greeted her with a smile that never touched his eyes. Casey sat, letter in hand, and read his words aloud. Watching, studying. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't deny authorship. He simply listened with the patience of someone who enjoyed being studied. Instead of answers, he gave her stories. "You'll need to think like someone who sees fabric as language," he told her. "A knot isn't just a knot, it's a sentence. A hem is a paragraph. And some people write whole manifestos in hems." Casey had spent years studying behavioral cues, but Elias unnerved her. Not because he was theatrical, but because he wasn't. His tone was calm, almost academic, as if they were 2 colleagues discussing a thesis. She kept her questions sharp, controlled. Was he involved? Did he know the Weaver? Elias chuckled softly, as though the question itself were naive. "I know this. When people start hiding meaning in handmade things, they are trying to fold themselves into anonymity. And someone who wants to be invisible," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "will always pick the most visible hiding place." He spoke of things Casey had only seen mentioned in passing. The history of the mills, the children who once apprenticed under seamstresses, learning to turn needles into weapons of discipline. He told her about whispered rumors, a guild of seamstresses who called themselves the Loom. They met in union halls, tobacco rooms, basements of churches where fabric was stockpiled. They weren't radicals, he claimed, but guardians of secrets. Women who stitched codes into collars and cuffs to pass messages during labor disputes. It sounded like myth. Yet the way he said it, precise, clinical, made it hard to dismiss. Elias wanted favors. Copies of police transcripts, newspaper clippings, the small tokens of outside life that let a manic mind feel tethered. Casey refused most of it, but she knew the game. Access was leverage. The more she dangled, the more he spoke. So they set a protocol. She would bring fragments of evidence. He would parse them. Each meeting was like patting down a bomb. Terrifying, necessary, unpredictable. Meanwhile, outside those prison walls, the city was changing. News of the Weaver spread through social feeds. People began posting photos of strange fabric tokens, swatches found on park benches, buttons glued to street lamps, scarves tied in unfamiliar knots. Some were hoaxes, some paranoia. But the fear was real. Neighborhoods invented rituals. Thrift stores left mannequins out front, clothed in quilts stitched with bright signals, calling them protection quilts. Mothers tied ribbons to playground fences, hoping to ward off whoever was taking their neighbors. Families of the missing were running out of patience. They didn't care about knots or guilds or riddles. They wanted answers, bodies, closure. Casey felt the weight of their eyes at every press conference. And then Elias delivered something useful. During their third meeting, Casey brought him a strip of silk from evidence, recovered from the Alvarez van. He asked for light. When a guard tilted the lamp, he squinted, lips curving into a slow, unsettling smile. "Invisible ink is not always ink," he murmured. "Sometimes it is thread." Held against the light, Casey saw it. Faint initials, almost microscopic, embroidered in nearly colorless thread. Not names, not words, numbers, coordinates. Back at the station, she matched them. They pointed to a derelict storage warehouse near the river, a place the city had all but abandoned, except for the occasional squatter. They got a warrant. The warehouse was vast, a cathedral of forgotten things. Rows of lockers stretched into darkness, each unit a coffin of discarded lives. Dust hung in the air like powder. When the team pried open the unit marked by the coordinates, the breath went out of the room. Inside, it wasn't junk. It was a gallery. Fabric stretched on wooden frames like canvases, each one meticulously preserved. Swatches of dresses, handkerchiefs, coats. At the corner of each piece, painted in small, careful letters, was a name, a date. Pinned above them were photographs. Faces of the missing. June Alvarez, Arthur Klein, others Casey recognized from the archive files. It was a shrine, not to death, but to ownership. The detectives cataloged, bagged, documented. Casey moved carefully, gloved hands brushing over a photograph snagged on a nail. June again, smiling at her sewing machine. Beneath the photo hung a dress frame, its hem stitched with something new. When she lifted it, she realized it was a map of the city itself. Tiny streets embroidered with obsessive precision, and one route highlighted in red thread. It ended on Huxley Street. Casey radioed it in, adrenaline surging. Huxley Street housed a tailor's shop, long abandoned but still listed in the city registry. It matched the matchbook found in Arthur's bus. But dispatch came back with a twist. The shop had closed 3 years ago. The tailor's name, the one Elias had casually mentioned, was already in the system. Dead, recorded as natural causes. Casey pulled the old coroner's file. The handwriting was faded, but the notes were chilling. Cause of death, respiratory failure. Circumstances, suspicious. Traces of smoke in the lungs. Previous history, multiple warehouse fires in his orbit. It looked less like natural causes, more like arson's aftermath. The name leapt off the page. Not Weaver, not Loom, but a man connected to both. And Casey realized with a sinking chill, Elias hadn't just given her riddles. He'd given her a breadcrumb trail straight to a corpse. As the investigation thickened, Casey's objectivity began to unravel. It was subtle at first, the way she lingered over fabric samples longer than necessary. The way she caught herself staring at knots as though they were glyphs in some secret alphabet. At night, she dreamed of textiles. She'd wake with the sensation of threads brushing her skin, hems whispering like voices in her ears. In the day, ordinary patterns betrayed her. The swirl of a hem reminded her of her mother's laugh. The rough weave of burlap carried the memory of her grandmother's fingertips as they braided bread towels. Elias seemed to know this. His letters arrived with surgical precision, cutting into her private fears. The best way to make a hunter, he wrote, is to hand them a thread that belongs to their own history. Casey read those words and hated that part of her agreed. Digging deeper into the city's industrial past, she unearthed the legend of the Huxley Mill. For decades, the mill was the city's spine. Families clocked 12-hour shifts under its iron roof. Generations grew up in its shadow. Then came the fire, a blaze so fierce it gutted the weaving floor, collapsing beams and silencing voices. Official reports called it an accident. Lawsuits followed, then were quietly buried. The mill closed. Its windows shattered, its bricks blackened, its history folded into silence. But survivors remembered. Casey and her team interviewed elderly former workers. They spoke of a man named Bennett Huxley, a foreman with a temper, a philanthropist in public, a disciplinarian in private. He kept order with uncanny skill. Some remembered his generosity. Others remembered the sting of his hand or the cold weight of his stare. After the fire, Bennett retreated. Records showed he died shortly after. But stories insisted otherwise, that he left something behind. A ledger, private sewing rooms, and a lie about what happened that night. The rumor unsettled Casey. Legends weren't evidence, but they carried a pulse. Then came the lab results. The fabrics from the shrine weren't just symbolic. Under microscopic analysis, they contained fragments, hair, skin, traces of DNA. They matched multiple missing people. These weren't memorials. They were trophies. The city erupted. Headlines screamed for arrests. Families demanded answers. The Bureau's attention landed on Mara Lowe, an activist, charismatic, outspoken. She ran a clothing drive, collecting donations for the city's poor. She had access to storage units, warehouses, trunks of forgotten garments. On paper, she was compassion incarnate. In practice, interviews painted another picture: short-tempered, obsessive, prone to berating donors for wrinkled clothes or stains. Volunteers described how she fixed tapestries compulsively, muttering names under her breath as she stitched. She insisted every garment had a spirit, every patch deserved a title. Her ledger matched inscriptions found in the shrine. Dates aligned too closely to ignore. They brought her in. Mara Lowe sat in the interview room like a woman carrying centuries of bitterness. Her story was strange, poetic. She claimed her work was not criminal but sacred, a memorial to forgotten victims of the mills, an archive of grief. She said she collected garments not to gloat, but to make the city remember. Her words had rhythm, conviction. The detectives saw delusion. But then they searched her home. Inside, warped mannequins dressed in unfinished garments. Hairpins and combs arranged like relics. Snapshots of women whose disappearances remained unsolved. Names scribbled in looping handwriting across fabric scraps. The team booked her. The public rejoiced. Headlines read, "The Weaver Caught." Casey should have felt relief. Instead, she felt hollow. The evidence fit too neatly. Mara's eccentric habits, her obsessive naming rituals, her archive of garments. It all locked into place like a puzzle completed. And yet Casey's instincts gnawed at her. Patterns can lie, she reminded herself. Sometimes the wrong piece fits just as easily as the right one. Her doubts sharpened when cyber forensics traced Mara's emails. Among her correspondence were messages routed through an encrypted account. Not Elias's name, not his handwriting, but the account linked to a bank, with small deposits labeled with a single word: Loom. Casey confronted Elias in the prison's interview room. He denied it, his voice calm, his gaze steady. "I have no need for proxies," he said. "I write when I choose to. Not for errands, not for money. Because language interests me. That is all." But then he sent her another letter. Different tone, less clinical, almost prophetic. "You will arrest someone who will sing as a martyr. Because your city needs a villain. But that will not end the pattern." Mara Lowe's trial was spectacle. She dressed in plain cotton dresses, refusing designer suits. She spoke directly to the jury, insisting she was not a criminal but an artist. Her defense called psychologists who framed her as a trauma survivor using textiles as therapy. They argued she was building an aesthetic archive of mourning. The prosecution was merciless. They painted her as a manipulator, a witch doctor of grief, profiting from loss, ritualizing destruction, feeding her ego by collecting human remains like trinkets. The jury convicted her on accessory charges. She was sentenced to years in prison. The city celebrated. Finally, they thought, The weaver was behind bars. Casey stood in the back of the courtroom as Mara was led away. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt the bottom drop out. Mara's confession was too rehearsed. Her evidence too theatrical. Someone had staged this. Someone had dressed her in guilt as carefully as a mannequin in a shop window. Her instincts screamed, "This is not the hand on the loom." That night, another letter arrived. Elias's handwriting. Tight. Controlled. "You have the wrong hands on the loom. Look not at the gathered, but at the gatherer." Casey read it 3 times. And for the first time since the case began, she realized she wasn't chasing a person. She was chasing a system. A gatherer. Not one hand. Many. The weaver was not done. You don't catch a predator by chasing the obvious. You catch them by chasing why they wanted to be obvious. The cultural officer, Lawrence Pritchard, was a man who curated museums and annual parades. He had glossy photos beside his fireplace of ribbon cuttings and child-friendly community shows. Under his polished exterior, investigators found something else. A private room in his townhouse filled with textile collages mapped to personal grudges, lists of names, dates, and a meticulous system of knots. He had receipts for tailored gloves and a pattern for an audience garment. Under interrogation, he cracked in fragments. He admitted to coordinating donation drives and collecting garments for heritage projects. He denied harming anyone. He insisted the shrine was a memorial and that the DNA must have been cross-contamination. He said he had stored donated items in the same units as other civic organizations. His words were plausible. Casey sat across from Pritchard and watched his hands. Neat nails, a ring on his little finger, the way his knuckles flexed when he lied. He told her, with a kindness that felt rehearsed, "We were trying to preserve history. The mill's ghosts needed a voice." He folded a handkerchief and placed it on the table like a peace offering. Piece by piece, the case came down to motive. Pritchard had been the city's curator for decades, and he had a mess to hide. The Huxley Mills fire had been an accident that exposed management negligence, and Pritchard's predecessors had swept claims under quilts to avoid scandal. Pritchard, obsessed with reparation, had sunk into an ideology that memory equals restitution. He believed that to make a public atonement, someone had to be seen to suffer and be remembered. He used his networks to find vulnerable workers, to lure them with offers of sewing work, to harvest their stories, and, when things went wrong, to turn removal into ritual. But the murderous acts? Pritchard kept denying them. "I curated the pain," he said. "I did not commit it." The DNA, the shrine, the logistic network, these were his work. But the violent disappearances? He had friends with more violent pasts. He admitted, people who had once done the dirty work of covering messes. He had used them, or they had used him. He could not, would not, be pinned as the hand that pulled a trigger. Elias read the newspapers with that same patient smile. He wrote, "A curator builds a museum of absence, but someone else arranges the bodies." Following the trail led them to a name that had been in the margins of the Huxley files, Darren Knox, a consultant who had worked for cleanup crews after industrial fires. Some placed him at Huxley the night of the blaze. Others saw him at the textile supply auctions, buying old uniforms in crates. He was a shadow man who knew how to move between discarded things and living ones without being noticed. Knox had a record of petty theft, but he had escaped charges of violence through witnesses who could not recall faces. They found him at a hospice for the homeless, a place where he volunteered to help people stitch their lives. He greeted the detectives with a smile like a man who expected to be complimented on taste. But when they searched his locker, they found a drawer of buttons, the same unusual hole arrangement as on the evidence swatches. In his phone, logged under a dummy social account, there were messages with dates and coordinates. He was a courier for Pritchard. In the narratives he told, he was a fixer, paid to make victims disappear quietly under the guise of charity. The arrest was messy. Knox tried to flee. He scraped his way into the river and forced a short chase through back alleys. When they finally had him in custody, the confession came not out of pain but from boring, meticulous boredom. He had enjoyed the cataloging, the feeling of control. "We were making a show," he admitted. "They were part of a story we were finishing." Elias watched the headlines celebrate an arrest. He wrote only one line back to Casey. "You caught 2 hands. What remains is the loom." Casey felt, at once, like someone who had closed a book only to find a photograph stuck between pages. Unsettling, intimate. The photograph had a date and a name. The name was Elias Crows. Trials are not cinematic in the way people expect. They are long, small moments. A witness breaks on cross. A lawyer gestures with emotion that suggests innocence. A judge frowns at a procedural quibble. Pritchard's hearing was a theater of polite denials. Knox pled guilty to several charges in exchange for testimony. Mara Lowe was a complicated witness whose art therapy argument resonated with a public weary of horror. Elias refused to speak in court beyond one statement. Language is an instrument. I taught people how to hear it. If you find my notes in someone's hand, that is not my handwriting. That is mimicry. The jury looked bored and severe. Elias's past crimes did not help him. They hardened the prosecution's portrait. Casey sat in the courtroom and watched people rearrange their beliefs about monsters. She had thought monsters were faceless, made of malice. She was wrong. Monsters are made of policy and neglect. They are made of cover-ups and compassion twisted into control. Monsters are people who decide what the city remembers and what it forgets. When everything came to verdicts, Pritchard convicted of conspiracy, Knox sentenced, Mara Lowe's conviction upheld. The families breathed in a way that sounded like relief. News cycles moved on. Memorial quilts were unrolled at the riverbank. People cried, and then they took photos. But Casey still had questions. Elias's fingerprints on the crate label might have a reasonable explanation: a visit for academic research, a request for archival materials. It was possible. It was also possible that Elias had been more than an observer. He had motive, a disgust at hypocrisy, means, a network of scholars, and opportunity, visits to the penitentiary that could arrange correspondence. Casey returned to the penitentiary for one last meeting. She sat across from Elias in the sterile visiting room and put a photograph on the table, the shrine's ledger, stained with years. She asked directly, "Did you orchestrate this?" Elias looked at the image and then at her face. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. I taught a class once on how culture encodes violence. I gave my students an assignment: take a story and make a shrine of it. A few took that as literal work. Others used it as a map. He leaned forward, and for a moment the world was small enough to hold them both. If I had the heart to direct bodies to places, would I have written letters to the police? Would I have handed you a map and then waited for you to find it? Or would I have kept the map to myself? The truth, Casey realized, was not binary. People can be architects of harm without physically throwing the first stone. They can be the men and women who build systems that allow violence to flourish. The curator who allows cover-ups. The fixer who takes money. The scholar who theorizes humanity into categories used to justify removing people deemed inconsequential. Elias was convicted on accessory charges for obstruction and for connections to the storage crates. The court sentenced him to additional years. The city called it a victory. The families called it bittersweet. But the photograph Casey had placed on the table, an old family portrait found among the shrine's items, suggested another truth. In it, a young Elias, barely out of his schooling, stood beside a woman with a hand on his shoulder. Casey recognized the woman's face from the ledger, June Alvarez's grandmother. They had once been friends. The ledger had a single, lonely entry next to that name: "Forgive us." On her drive home, Casey thought about forgiveness. She thought about how the city would stitch its wounds over time. She thought about June's thread, delicate and stubborn. In the weeks that followed, the shrine was dismantled and donated. The city set up a small memorial in the park where some names were read aloud and others remained silent in the hem of time. Elias wrote one last letter to Casey before it was sealed and cataloged. It read, simply, "We all stitch to be remembered. Some of us stitch to be noticed. Be careful what you choose to remember, because remembrance keeps people alive, and accusation kills what it remembers." Casey kept that letter, put it in a drawer, and learned to work with a new understanding. That crimes are rarely single-threaded. They are tapestries of choices. You can pull at the obvious stitches and watch the surface fall away. But if you want a city to be safer, you must also pull at the underlying seams, the policies, the neglect, the places where people slip through the weave.